policies which were tough, which were going to be unpopular, and that was what she did. And by the end of her time in office, Britain was a country whose economy, I think, was much more admired and much more respected and much sounder.
You can't deny
until it imploded with
Sorry?
the banking, until it imploded with the banking crisis.
So everything was all right until then, was it?
No, it wasn't. I mean, she laid the seeds for the problems we face today. I don't have any doubt that she is the most powerful figure to occupy number 10 during my political career. I respect the fact that she believed in things and she didn't worry about focus groups or what the papers were saying or whether people liked her. She had a set of beliefs, she drove forward and she changed Britain in exactly the same way that we've just seen. But I think it's a much worse Britain. We had a society where we now see a huge housing crisis because you wouldn't let councils build. We used to have millions of well-paid jobs that working class men did in manufacturing. That was wiped out because she favoured the banks. And we now live with the consequences
That's
of all
all
that.
her fault.
All her fault. She adopted an
fault.
economic strategy which was fundamentally flawed. And one thing Norman said that was wrong, we never achieved the levels of GDP growth and investment that we had in the Keynesian era that she snuffed out. And the same happened in America. Reagan did the same thing. And the tragedy is that when eventually they were defeated, and Clinton came to power in the States and Blair came to power here, they didn't have the courage she had to turn it round.
Well, frankly, I'm sorry to say this, but I think that is slightly absurd. Mrs. Thatcher left office in 1997. She left
1990.
Sorry, I bet it was 20 years since Mrs. Thatcher was in office, and to blame her for things that happened under Gordon Brown, under Tony Blair, things that are happening
today.
But
they adopted her policies.
I think
it was on her watch that Big Bang happened in the city, wasn't it?
Yeah, but there's a lot more deregulation. That are you really wanting to go back, when you say Big Bang, to having regulation over the terms in which people may buy a kettle or a refrigerator in a supermarket?
It's perhaps preferable to national bankruptcy.
The national bankruptcy that we have stemmed from inadequate regulation of the banks and from government overspending. Mrs. Thatcher, that was the one thing that she turned round. She inherited a massive deficit, as we have today, and she put the getting rid of that deficit as the number one priority.
What about this argument? Shirley Williams, perhaps you should come in here. What about this argument that we heard made in the film, that she somehow made selfishness respectable?
Yes, I think that's true. I think she was undoubtedly a patriot, but really, I think some of the commentators have gone completely over the top. I mean, we are today a country which is very, very unequal indeed, where the poor are growing poorer and the rich are growing richer. And part of that was because Mrs. Thatcher certainly undid some of the regulations that applied at that time to banks. And they, I think, then decided to take their objectives in their own hands and run with it. So although I approve of the acceptance of her courage, many of her judgments, I think, have left us with a country which is quite deeply divided and where many, many people are not enjoying the prosperity that's being talked about. It just isn't true. And Ken was quite right about...
Let me just bring in Douglas Hurd here.
Ken was right about housing.
When you look at how this country functions now, Douglas Hurd, it is a much more atomised sort of place, isn't it, after the Thatcher reforms?
What do you mean by atomised?
I mean, people live much more individual lives and much fewer, much smaller, much less significant collective lives.
I doubt if that's really true.
How do you want to judge it? Trades unions? A shadow of their former selves.
That's a thoroughly good thing.
That's why we don't have any industry.
But you are talking as though Mrs. Thatcher was responsible for today, everything that has happened today. When people talk about inequality, inequality's got a lot worse under Blair and Brown than it ever was under Mrs. It increased under Mrs. Thatcher, but increased much more. When you talk about the atomization of society, things like the internet and so on have profoundly altered society. You can't blame all the things you dislike about modern Britain Britain on someone who left office so long ago. And when you talk about division, just remember how deeply, deeply divided Britain was before she came to power. The 3-day week, Arthur Scarborough, the NUM, the trade unions trying to run the country, that all went and we became eventually a more harmonious society.
When Mrs. Thatcher was asked, what's your greatest legacy, she said New Labour. And people thought it was a joke, but it wasn't. New Labour bought the ideology, she won that argument and debate. And therefore they didn't turn it back. And they carried on with her mistakes. They carried on not building council housing. They neglected to ensure that we rebuilt our manufacturing.
Socialism, then?
I think socialism may have still some great times ahead of it, but then I've always been an optimist. But also, it is a more atomised society. People had the time. People didn't have to hold down 2 jobs. They had time to see their family. They put things into the community. Grown-ups went and helped with youth activities and things like that. If you actually go back and check, the 1970s, which have been demonised by the Tories for 30 years, we were the 3rd happiest country in the world. For all the bad publicity, people felt you go and check Dr. Gallup.
I don't know how we measure happiness.
Opinion polls.
That I think maybe for priests or for opinion posters, but
people aren't happier
pretty
today.
difficult to be objective. But one thing Mrs. Thatcher did was to make home ownership much more widespread. That is to make people happy.
That is atomising, but that's a good atoms.
But
these are good atoms.
She encouraged people to buy property, which really they shouldn't, just like in the States. Now home ownership is collapsing in Britain, and we're in a position where here in London average people can't have any hope of buying a home. We stopped building. That was the real crime. Letting people buy their council house was no great shakes, as long as you carried on building more. We've had 30 years of not building, and shamefully Blair carried on with that policy too. We now have 2 million families on the waiting list.
Ken. It gave them the idea that they were responsible for their own destinies.
And they weren't, because when it all imploded with the banking crisis, we've seen
You think
lives
there's genuinely
destroyed.
no difference between someone who owns their own home and someone who lives permanently in state-rented accommodation?
I grew up on a council estate.
I'm not talking about you. Is there any difference?
No, I mean, I grew up on a council estate, secure environment, everyone had a job, working class and middle class families. People didn't feel they had to have a home to justify themselves.
If things were so terrible, Brown and Blair had ample opportunity to reverse it. They chose not to reverse it because they understood that the British public accepted the Thatcher settlement, liked what she'd done, and they would get a bad reception of their
Let's bring in Shirley Williams again here. Shirley Williams, I hope you're hearing us fine. Sorry, your view about what the social consequences of these political changes were?
I think I've described some of the social consequences, which I think were unfortunate. I think that they tended to make a more bitter and envious society. But what's also true, I think, is that Mrs. Thatcher didn't live in a world which was becoming globalised. She was very much a national figure. She didn't, I think, take very kindly to the changes in Britain itself, which I think are good ones, in terms of much greater integration of different races, different religions and so forth. She was always a deeply contentious figure. She was a very brave one, but she was contentious. She rarely tried to find a bringing together of people that would have made, I think, this a happier country than it is. And when people talk about what a happy country it is, I have to say that if you compare it with, say, Scandinavia or with Holland, it would be hard to argue that case. So, no, I think the case being made for her is being overstated very considerably. What's certainly true, a brave woman, a contentious woman, a woman who was absolutely clear about what she wanted, but who I think listened very little to other people, didn't have a conversational style, didn't bring her cabinet into the picture very much, and I think therefore was essentially brave but divisive.
I think she was moving with
She found a country which was in a desperate state, partly because it had shirked some of these basic issues, which she then brought out and imposed her own solutions on. But this was a good thing. At least in the beginning it was a good thing. You can argue whether it should have gone too far, but it was a good thing to bring these issues out and make it possible for people, for individuals, to atomise themselves, if that's what they wanted.
Do you think she went too far?
I don't think she went too far. I think you can argue that she went too far. I'm one of those who actually think that she should have left office a little bit earlier. I think she'd have been happier, and I think that would have been a better outcome for her and for the country.
I think also one of the things about the changes she wrote is they went with the grain of history. They anticipated what was going to happen in many countries throughout the globe. They followed the same model of lower taxation, privatisation, rolling back the frontiers of the state and giving decision-making more and more to the individual.
I mean, look what we
It's
pay
not
now
working.
for our
It's
energy.
not
Look what we
working
pay
well
for our
at all.
telephone bills. Privatisation was a rip-off. What you had is huge profits being made. If you look at America, where 1 person in 10 lives in a city where they didn't privatise their energy, they pay 10% less a year. I mean, privatisation was a scam.
If you saw in that film the privatisation of British Telecom, I don't know whether you remember, but before it was privatised, you used to have to depend on the post office, wait 6 weeks to get a line. You look through the other privatisations,
There was only one
oil, gas...
only one provider of telephones
exactly,
as well.
yeah,
But that was because the
state
Treasury...
owned Thomas Cook.
The Treasury never allowed
What
the
was the
level of
state
investment
doing
in the
Thomas
state
Cook?
sector.
No.
And if you actually look, the day Thatcher came to power, public sector investment was 5.5% of GDP. She took it down to 1%. We live with the consequences of that today. That's the reality of it. Our level of investment is about just under 14% today. At the height of the Keynesian boom in the mid-70s, we got it up to 20%. That's the legacy
The
of
height
this.
of the Keynesian boom almost ruined the country and made us bankrupt.
Then why are we in the mess we're in today if it was all so wonderful?
The mess we're in today has everything to do with your friends and very little to
Because
do
they
with
believe
Mrs.
Mrs.
Thatcher.
Thatcher's nonsense.
They could have run the country as they wanted.
If they listened to me.
But on telecommunications, I think it is an interesting point because it wasn't just that she privatised BT. She made it possible for other people to supply telephones. And at the time, people like Ken were saying, you can't have more than one network in telecommunication. This is like having roads in
What
parallel.
I was saying in
They all said
1983
it couldn't be done.
was you
and
should
she saw
have
that it was
a
possible.
broadband system in Britain. And you needed a state corporation to do that. We could have been the leading figures in that. That was in 1983. Instead, no, privatise that. We missed a great opportunity. We could have had Microsoft and all the great internet new opportunities here in this country.
Shirley Williams, you've been trying to get in. I hope you can hear us now. What was it you've been trying to say?
Well, what I was trying to get in to say was that Mrs. Thatcher is actually a good deal more cautious than she's being discussed in this programme. A lot of the privatisation, most of the privatisation took place under John Major. Mrs. Thatcher never tackled the National Health Service. Yes, it was. She stood away from railway privatisation and so forth because all the time she was conscious of what the political outcome was going to be. I think it was quite clear that some of her successors were more, particularly John Major, were more keen on privatisation than she was. She always thought in terms of what the political outcome might be, and she never went further until her last term, beyond where she could carry the public. In her last term, as I think Douglas Hurd suggested, she then, in the sense, threw caution to the winds and became very much more extreme in her views. And that was the point at which the cabinet revolted and finally decided not to follow her.
I'd just like to explore. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to look at her achievements internationally in a moment or two.
Right.
I wanted to ask you, as a former foreign secretary, do you think this country stood higher in the world after her time, or
Certainly.
Slightly eccentric?
No, I think the courage which she showed on specific occasions after the Brighton bomb in the Falklands, that was something which the world saw and respected. I was with her the last weekend of her premiership when we were in Paris signing a treaty, and I went to the party which Mitterrand gave, and the atmosphere of people wondering how possibly could Margaret Thatcher have strayed into a position where she was actually at risk. Some of them carried scars from her, but the idea that Britain could be represented by anybody else than Margaret Thatcher struck them with amazement and actually regret.
Thank you all very much.